two speakers. So we are now moving on to the session ESG Assessments and Tools for Investors. Now, the first speaker is, let me introduce the first speaker, Ms. Wong Dan-chi. Dan-chi is the Asia ESG specialist at Schroders, part of the 20-member strong sustainable investment team. She's based in Singapore and supports the company's ESG integration and policy engagement on ESG in APAC. In addition, Dan-chi serves as the vice chair of the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, AIGCC. She's also the adjunct faculty at Singapore Management University teaching sustainability at postgraduate level. Dan-chi has specialized in ESG in Asia since 2010, when ESG was in its nascent stage regionally. Prior to joining Schroders, she has worked at KPMG, at a sustainability consultancy, and at an asset manager. Thank you, Dan-chi, for speaking today, and the mic is yours.
Thank you, Yuki. Let me just share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to share and to be part of the Thai investment community's journey. I'm extremely inspired to hear Dr. Sriyanka's leadership and passion on this topic, which is globally important and especially more so in emerging markets. So today we will be introducing our tools, SustainEx, which is one of our many tools. And a unique part about this tool is that it attempts to quantify social and environmental impacts of our investments. Moving on. Yep, so just a very brief sort of whistle stop. I won't go through every single detail, but I think it's just to reflect why we are able to share this tool, the experience we have. We have about 20 over years looking at ESG. I'm part of a team of 20 and we're dedicated ESG specialists. And what we do want to highlight is that our sustainability team is very investment-led in our approach to ESG. And I think that signals to the message that Dr. Sriyanka and Yuki were both highlighting, that it does come down to how it impacts your investments at the end of the day. As an active investment manager, I think we do increasingly see how the relationship between social and environmental challenges will impact the investments that we manage. And what this means is that it requires us to move from a two-dimensional view of the world, so traditionally on risk and return, and to introduce a third dimension, which is impact. And to that end, we have developed a suite of tools, which we put under the umbrella of Impact IQ, of which SustainEx is one. We are very pleased that SustainEx has been presented the award for innovation at the Sustainable and ESG Investment Awards, and also at the prestigious Environmental Finance Impact Awards for the first place for impact reporting and measurement. So I'll be the first to tell you that it's not perfect, but I think it's important to know that this is the direction of travel, and this is definitely where we'll invest a lot of resources, bringing together our investment teams and the ESG team to bring this to fruition. And now on the tool itself, so I will go through each step of 1, 2, 3, but I want to first show you the overview. So what SustainEx is, so we hear a lot about externalities, about social and environmental impacts, putting cost to society. And you have seen this in various industry reports and various academic reports. But however, I think that one big issue is that a lot of these are not being translated to be used fit for purpose for investors. And that's effectively what we are trying to do. So it's robust and it's very much evidence-based. It's a proprietary tool that we built on over 700 academic and industry studies of these social impacts, what the costs are. For each company, we look at over 70 data points, and where it's not disclosed, we estimate it. And using our proprietary sort of methodology, we are able to expand this to cover 16,000 global companies, which is, I think, one of the key points of SustainEx, because what we hear our investors are saying is that when you get sporadic data points, it's very hard to be able to see the impact at a portfolio level basis. So moving on to the 1, 2, 3 parts of the slide, the premise at step 1 is that these companies generate impacts on society. And we do see that increasingly with regulation as well as stakeholder pressure, companies are being made to pay for those impacts, which are currently not due to market failure and other issues. At the second stage, again, based on academic and industry studies, we look at all the different sort of possible impacts. And I think what's worthwhile highlighting is we want to look at both the positive and negative impacts. And this speaks to what Dr. Sriyanka, was talking about in terms of the balance of thinking about how it ultimately affects different stakeholders. And there's a trade-off and balance that we need to consider as well. And finally, on the third step, all these, we merge all these impacts across different impacts, for example, salaries and benefits, which speaks to the living wage and alcohol production, which we'll show an example later. And we are able to see the complete impact that a company has. So I'll go on to more details and the next steps. So this was step 1. And I think to sort of breeze through it, I think we probably all know in this, people in this seminar, that what we are trying to look at is that impacts that are not reflected in financial statements. So it's not so much about what the company is able to produce a benefit that is already internalized, so people pay for it, but what is actually social deficits and credits that are not actually being borne by companies. And so we estimate a value for each of these impacts. This reflects an idea of all the various business activities that contribute to the social cost and benefits that we see. And we take a very stakeholder-based approach where we look at how there are different impacts and everything from biodiversity, bribery, armed violence, access to water, injuries and fatalities, just to point out some of those that relate closely to human rights. Now that you have the understanding of the backdrop of SustainEx, this is an example that I want to talk you through in terms of how we actually look at each impact to put that cost. So for example, for alcohol, we look at the social cost that alcohol would bring. And this is based on academic studies again. And so from there, we define what is the estimated global social burden of alcohol use that is not being captured by markets currently. And in the example of alcohol, we look at 17 academic studies. Thereafter, in the third step, based on that social cost, we attribute it to different companies. And we do that looking at the market share and also the percentage of global alcohol sales that each company contributes to. And so you can see that this is a deviation from looking at an additional lens that we look at for companies beyond what the company is actually doing and sort of trying to rate its practices and policies relative and trying to take the very objective view of bringing in science and evidence as well from academic studies, which has been previously quite separate, I think, from the investment dialogue. So this slide shows all the impacts and how we, from the studies that we look at, what these costs reflect. So you can see on the very left-hand side, for example, salaries, which effectively we are measuring the benefit when a company pays its employees above the living wage. So that speaks, I think, directly to the human rights that we talk about and the amount of benefit that contributes that's currently not being captured or necessarily rewarded. And all the way right to the end, to the right, where we look at carbon dioxide emissions, and that speaks to climate change in terms of the negative externalities, which very often, we do expect it to exacerbate human rights concerns driven by unequal access to basic and safe living and working conditions. There are a few others which I think I briefly talked about, but I won't go into details, for example, in terms of injuries, fatalities, and access to water as well. So this is what you see at a global level for each impact combined across all companies. In the next slide, this is what it looks like at a company level. So the benefit of SustainEx is that it not just looks at the cost, as I mentioned, which you can see here in terms of the bars in red, but also the positive sides that it contributes that are not being captured. For example, through the salaries, which is a big part in providing jobs above living wage, donations, training it has, and as well, and it sort of blends it ultimately to the total that you see to the right of the slide. And the benefit of that is that we are able to compare across companies and able to have information at a portfolio level. So this is a slide to demonstrate and as an example of what could be reported based on this SustainEx tool. So if I start from the top left, we would be able to have a SustainEx score for the fund as well as a benchmark. And we would be able to compare across many different companies held within these funds and benchmark. We are able then to drill down to the bottom on the impact on people and as well on the impact on planet. And there you can see again, we break down what relates to people. And you would see what the contribution is to the fund and the benchmark in terms of its SustainEx value. There's a breakdown beneath that where we grouped it, for example, to what it benefits people. There's the salaries, impact again, medicine provision, connectivity, and as well as avoiding harm to people in terms of the negative impacts. And then to the right, that's where you would see the impact on planet. And you would see that it's not to say that a company or portfolio does not have any environmental impact at all, but we are, I think, able to have a sense of how it compares to the fund and benchmark. While we're on this slide, I would like to share how would an investment manager actually use it. I think at the very minimum, this offers a lens of bridging academic vigorous evidence back to what a company, an investment manager, or an analyst would be looking at, and provide that lens of impact beyond, I think, more subjective ratings. It also allows us, so the investment manager, depending on the mandate and investment objectives, would be able to say, for example, I want to make sure that my fund is performing relative to the benchmark, which we see quite often especially in emerging markets, because with the status of development and the trade-offs and the considerations, I would say, to be honest, quite impossible to say that just tomorrow we want to have an absolute positive impact. But we also see some investment managers looking to say that we want to ensure that our SustainEx value of our fund is an absolute positive. So I think the point here is to illustrate that with this tool, we think that at the very minimum, it offers a different lens, which our investors find to be useful beyond what they do. And this is one of our many tools. And we see that investors are also actively using it to compare their fund performance and their fund impact compared to the benchmark. So on this slide, I want to, I hope you have found the introduction to SustainEx interesting. We are very honored and humbled to have won awards for this tool in recognition of the efforts of our ESG, our investment, our data and technology teams that have made this possible. But we're certainly not resting on our laurels. And we do continue to tap on the collective experience and expertise of our investment teams, very importantly, ESG teams and technology teams to bring the data that is available to improve the accuracy of this impact measurement. So for example, when we first started out on this tool, we looked at 400 academic studies. And a year or so later, we expanded that to 700. So it's a continuous process. SustainEx is only one of our suite of tools and research to support our investors in their investment decision making. So for example, topically today, we have built a modern slavery tool to identify sectors and geographies that are more prone to modern slavery and human rights risks. So that's not unlike the heat map that Dr. Sriyanka shared. And what this does is that investors would be able to pick up companies that they may want to prioritize in terms of digging into the company for further analysis and engagement. Finally, I think it would be remiss not to mention engagement. When it comes to human rights, active ownership, so engagement, proxy voting, and having the dialogue is what we term as active ownership and stewardship. And it is a key pillar in our ESG work. So through that, we seek to influence companies through our engagements. I think this speaks to, again, the, engage before you consider divesting approach, which we think it's extremely important in emerging markets. And I do a lot of that work, within our investors and also across with other colleagues from other investment firms on a collaborative approach to exert that kind of influence. But also the ultimate aim is really to let companies know that we do care about this issue. We explain to them why we care about it and we see it as a risk and why we see it as a risk. For example, illustrating to them what the UK Modern Slavery Act is asking for, what the Australian Modern Slavery Act is asking for, and what that means for them. We explain what debt bondage is. And I think it's important that we do it in a very collaborative and collegial manner to show that we want to support them in this journey. We know that it's a very complicated journey, and we want to be able to be part of that process to educate and share with them. And with that, those conversations, we follow them and monitor them. So we have a tracking system where we track our stewardship activities since 2000. So we understand that this is a multi-year process, but we do expect to see progress as an indication of their understanding of the risk involved. And with that, I conclude my presentation. I'm aware that we are short of time. To summarize again, today, I think we very happy to have the opportunity to share about SustainEx in terms of what it does, of quantifying environmental and social impacts in an objective manner, looking at both cost and benefits. And we are able to use that information for investors to look at it at a company level as well as a portfolio level. And beyond SustainEx, we also have a suite of tools and research. And we look at engagement as a big part of how we influence companies and also work together with other investors to support companies in the human rights journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Danchi. Just a very quick question from my side. Do you use any of the rating agencies' scores within your tools or within your research and analysis?
If we're talking about SustainEx specifically, we look at we pretty much use a lot of raw data. So we do definitely rely on data providers, but not in terms of that subjective analysis, but in terms of getting that raw data and analysis. And I guess more broadly speaking, we do avail ourselves of the resources and the research that the third-party providers look at, and we, make sure that our investors are aware of what's going on in the market. But I think, as also alluded to, we do find that subjectivity being an issue for us to use it and directly, not to, I think, put down the good work and a lot of effort that ESG rating agencies have done. But so the ultimate step that I think we often do take to support our investors is to build these proprietary tools.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for your time, Danchi. And we hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now let me move on to introducing our second speaker, Ms. Sylviane Carot. She's from MSCI. Sylviane is the Executive Director, Asset Owner Lead for MSCI, covering index and ESG research business lines. Sylviane is responsible for leading the business development with institutional investors, including sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, central banks, and insurers in Southeast Asia since 2015. She has 18 years of experience in business development for the finance industry. Prior to joining MSCI, Sylviane worked for 6 Financial Information, Interactive Data, now ICE, BNP Paribas, and CDC ICSIS Capital Markets. Sylviane is also active in supporting female empowerment within MSCI and in the industry. So thank you, Sylviane, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yuki, for the introduction. And I would also like to thank GPF for the invitation. And it's very inspiring to see GPF leading the way in the ESG topic in Thailand, but also in ASEAN, under, of course, Dr. Sylviane's leadership. Let me share my screen. Let me know when you can see it.
Yes, we can see it. Can you make it full screen? Yeah.
Yes, is it full screen?
Yes, right. It is now. Thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of the presentation today, there will be 2 parts. The first one is to present the ESG ratings methodology in general. And on the second one, I will focus on how do we assess human rights issues. So how do we look at ESG ratings? So I heard Dr. Sylviane mention we look at ESG from a risk factor perspective, and this is exactly how we also look at it at MSCI. So our ESG rating solution is a letter rating from AAA to CCC, and it's a real signal which focuses on the most financially material ESG risk factor and risk exposure. So we follow 4 steps when building our rating. So I will share more details in the following slides, but just to summarize, the first one is that we use the analysis of corporate governance as a starting point, where we do a deep dive analysis. In the second step, we look at the most relevant key issues or key factors per industry. In the third step, we look for each of the key issues at the ESG exposure, but also as well as the risk exposure and how well they manage this risk. On the fourth step, where we get to the final later ratings, and we look at the leaders and the laggards, and we look at the performance relative to their peers. So coming back to the first step, where the corporate governance analysis. So here it's important to note that the score is an absolute assessment, and it's consistent across all companies and uses a universally applied 0 to 10 scale. So how we start with a perfect 10 score with each of the companies, and then we will deduct points along the way. So we use these 4 sub-teams, such as board. We look at the side, gender diversity. Are there any women on board, for example? The second one would be pay. Is it robust data on CEO pay? Any link between the performance and the pay? The third one will be ownership and control. Is it, family conglomerate? What the shareholder rights looks like, or any major owners? And we'll also look at the accounting structure in place. What you see here in the second step is what I call the library, or the taxonomy of the ESG key issues that we have in our model for each of the 3 pillars. But you can also see at the bottom the opportunities and environmental and social to look at the positive side of what companies are putting in place. So for example, on the environmental opportunities, you can look at clean tech or green building or renewable energies, for example. So the question is, how do we select the key issues? So we will select from 3 to 8 key issues per industry. The idea is to have, for each of the 3 pillars, E, S, and G, no more than 8 key issues. The reason we do that is that we don't want to dilute the signal of the assessment of the company. Staying on the second step, so here on this slide is a simplistic way of how we do it. So you have 11 sectors. So these are all based on our GIGS industries, and you have 4 key issues that I will also detail. So these are all coming from academic research. And for example, we will look at carbon emissions, and we'll look at the CO2 per millions of carbon emissions. And also for the health and safety, we'll look at the fatalities per millions of workers. So what we do is that we run through the different sectors and we see which sectors have more frequency to each of the topic. So what you can see for the carbon emissions, it will be a key issue and it's significant for the utilities, energy, and material sectors, but it's very low for the financials. Health and safety on the right side, which is represented by the fatalities per millions of workers, will be material for energy, materials, and industrial sectors. The reason why it's not material for finance, it's a bit more obvious because we're all kind of safe in our work office. So we'll use different, I would say, key issues for the financial sectors. And water stress key issue would be critical for utilities, and as well as privacy and data security will be critical for the discretionary sector and financials. In this slide, it's very important on this step 3. So what we do is that each of the key issue models is made of 2 components. On the left, you have the level of exposure, and on the right, you would have the management capacity or risk management. So on the level of exposure, what we do is that we look at the business activity of the company, what they do, what type of products and service they're offering to their clients. We will look at, for example, the breakdown of the company's business in terms of revenues, assets, or operations. We also look at the geographic segment risk exposure, and we will look the same breakdown in terms of geographics, in terms of revenues, assets, operations. And also we look at the size of the company, the number of employees, and if they have any reliance on government contracts or reliance on outsourced productions, for example. On the risk management part, so what we're interested here is on the commitment of the company related to these key issues. So our assessment of company's ability to manage its risk exposure on a key issue would fall under 3 categories. The first one would be strategy and governance, or policies and commitments. So what we do is that we look at the practice scores. So it doesn't mean that you say that you're implementing such policy, that you're really doing them in the reality. And these are the kinds of checks that we do. Is there any CEO or sustainability group within the firm? And what is the level of commitment from the CEO, for example, to address the key issues, risk, and opportunities? The second one we look at will be initiatives and programs. Does your company have targets and programs? For example, we see a lot of companies now that have carbon emissions reduction targets. So what we see is that if the companies are really able to manage and reach these targets. The third one will be performance, what we call performance. So here we kind of evaluate the track record on managing the specific risk of opportunities. So concretely, we look how well the company did manage over time its policies. And we also look at companies if they had any major controversies in the past, or if they're faced some of them now. So in here, to summarize and to give you a concrete example, let's say that you're a mining company and you are located in Canada, where there's a lot of water, and that you need to extract something that is not really water intensive. Well, their exposure to water risk, for example, would be less than a company that is operating in Iran or in Kazakhstan, for example, and extracting gold, which is highly water intensive, and the company is generating 99% of revenue of that mine. So what we say here is that companies facing higher risk exposure must have stronger management practices in place to mitigate their risk. Here is the chart of where we arrive to the final letter rating. So I mentioned the key issues. So they will be then aggregated and normalized by industry. And then we will arrive to the letter ratings between AAA being, of course, the best one and CCC the worst one. And what we do is that the assessment of the company are not absolute, but they are explicitly intended to be relative to the standards and performance of a company's industry peers. I will now go into the second section of looking in details of how we assess human rights issues. So with this slide, I would like to step back a bit here and mention about the Ruggie framework. So in 2008, the United Nations Special Representative John Ruggie proposed a framework to the United Nations Human Rights Council to address the fundamental relationship between business activities and human rights. So the Ruggie framework aligned a three-pillar approach, and Dr. Schroders also mentioned this. So the three main principles: one, protect. So the state duty to protect against human rights abuses by third parties, including business, through appropriate policies and regulations. Number two, respect. The corporate responsibility to respect human rights. Number three, remedy. Both state and business responsibility to provide greater access by victims to effective remedy, both judicial and non-judicial. So we all agree that the spectrum of these internationally recognized human rights is extremely broad. And this is exactly in the same spirit that we cover human rights concern across our 37 key issues. Instead of having one isolated key issues looking at human rights, we have several key issues within MSCI looking at human rights issues. This is reflecting the complexity and the multidimensionality of that concern. So you can see I have put in red here in the taxonomy that I showed earlier. I have highlighted in red the 7 key issues that we look at, whether they manifest in companies' own operations, throughout their supply chain, endanger indigenous communities, access to land resources, so involve contract security providers, or focus of freedom on speech, civil liberties. So you can see under the E pillar, biodiversity and land use key issues. For example, is there any community impact assessment? Under the S pillar, we would have labor management key issues. For example, we can look at the code of conduct of each company. Health and safety key issues will also be under the S pillar. Are there any, what are, for example, the living conditions for the workers? How the dormitories, do they have any safe environment, for example? We look at supply chain labor standards, controversial sourcing key issues, and privacy and data security. And I will give more example on that after. And under the G pillar, would have corruptions and instability key issues. So in terms of the indicators that we have here, you can see that they are quite well aligned with the Ruggie recommendations in the sense that we would have indicators that capture each of the operational principles. So the level of exposure to potential human rights violations, and therefore the level of urgency in implementing mitigation measures. Policy commitments in place too. Any commitments to international labor conventions, like the ILO conventions, for example, or individual rights on their data. What is the level of due diligence in place with these companies, and how well, and if it's then implemented through the operations? Are there any impact assessments in place, any auditing mechanism? Also in terms of remediation, we look at the grievance mechanisms or also about the living wage. So I took a bit of time on this slide because it's key to understand how we assess them in our ratings. In this one, I'll go more an example of the supply chain risk. So remember what I mentioned with the key issues being a composition of 2 components, risk exposure and management capacity. So in here, you can look at the risk exposure for the supply chain. And when evaluating the company's exposure to reputational risk or production of disruptions due to substandard treatment of supply chain workers, for example, we look at the products. So the question is, are these items more likely to be produced with child labor, like the textile industry, for example. And we also factor the location of the outsourced production. So the idea is that where are the third-party suppliers located? Usually when they are located in emerging markets, there will be more risk than in developed markets, for example. And we also look at the brand's vulnerability and the level of control of the company over the branding. Here we look at the risk management part. So which are the policies that are put in place to mitigate, the supply chain issues? It's interesting because what you can see in this slide is that 11% of companies still do not ban. So here's on the, I would say, negative access. They do not ban child labor in their suppliers code of conduct. Another example, 31% of companies do not have training on labor rights with suppliers, and 60% do not have reporting on instances of suppliers non-compliance. Another example here would be, I mentioned earlier that privacy and data security was also a key issue in our ESG ratings that touch upon human rights. Violation of privacy can trigger financial and social harm for individuals whose data is compromised. And I would like to say that even ultimately, it may undermine democracy should personal data be exploited to manipulate opinions, for example, to influence elections, or surveil and predict citizens' social behavior. So what we do here is that we precisely evaluate companies' practice with regards to the protections of individual personal data, which is a fundamental human right. For the risk management side, on the privacy and data key issue, so we look at the enforcement of protection measures that can reduce, for example, security vulnerability and lower costs of cyber attacks. On this slide, so we have the Ponemon Institute that has concluded that measures such as the formation of an incident response team, extensive use of encryption, employee training, and the appointment of a chief information security officer can reduce the cost of data breach, and it has also quantified the impact. What I want to show you here, and this is where I'll end my presentation, I want to end up with a concrete use case and how we present this in our ESG reports. So in here, I've shown VALE, which is a Brazilian multinational corporation engaged in metals and mining, and one of the largest logistics operators in Brazil. So they have a CCC rating since January 2019, and this has been degraded from B. So it's a huge downgrade. Maybe some of you may recall that they faced the collapse of the Feijão mine tailing dam in 2019, resulting in the spillage of millions of tons of non-toxic mud, killing 200 people and leaving approximately 100 people missing so far. Vale has also faced community opposition over the safety and environmental risk posed by its operation, and especially by its dam. They also face allegations of insufficient aid to residents and cutting payout to victims of the 2015 Mariana Dam failure. Moreover, Vale's plan to expand its garages operations in the biodiverse regions of Brazil could increase its exposure to risk associated with disturbing fragile ecosystems and local communities. So you can see that here in terms of human rights, we have several relations example. Here we show the detailed ESG rating scorecard of Vale. And we can see that they have the lowest scoring compared to global peers, indicating concerns in multiple areas. So I'll just name a few. For example, biodiversity and end use key issue that I explained earlier. So they have a score 0, the lowest. So Vale is involved in severe and very severe controversies, and 96% of operations from business lines are prone to environmental disturbance. They are also involved in severe and very severe controversies affecting community relations. And here, 80% of the operations are derived. from business lines that may impact natural ecosystems or the livelihood of local communities. In addition, we noticed limited to no commitment at all towards the protection of human rights and scarce evidence of community engagement initiatives. Also, on the health and safety key issues, which has a low score also of 1.2, where there is limited efforts to reduce employee injuries and fatalities. So this is a concrete example that we had and where I'll end up my presentation, but I wanted to show you in general how we rate the issues and then how human rights issues fit into our rating. And I've ended up with a concrete use case and of example of some companies that have faced severe, I would say, human rights violations. So now I would leave the floor to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you very much, Sylviane. We have actually one question from the floor, if you would be able to answer. So how does MSCI consider local legislation of the operating firm within its rating model?
In terms of what we do look at, let's say, what is publicly available in terms of the companies or any legislation. So we will look at it and we would assess, what has been going on in the market, sorry, as well as regulations and how they can help also improve, for all the markets. So, but everything needs to be disclosed publicly. Like I mentioned, it's not because a company is saying, oh, I'm going to put this in practice. I've been doing a really good job. If there's nothing in practice and nothing is public, let's say you just do a PowerPoint internal presentation, this won't have any value. So we really need something that is publicly announced, I would say. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Sylviane, for joining us today. Thank you. Thank you. So we will now break for lunch, and we've extended our morning session, but we'd like to resume at the scheduled time of 13:30 Bangkok time. After lunch, we have a big session focused on how Thai companies are tackling human rights challenges. Sadly, I will not be joining you this afternoon, but I'm very happy to introduce the new moderator for this afternoon, Mr. Supawit Chotuwit, Senior Director, Investment Research Department at the Government Pension Fund. He will be your moderator this afternoon. So thank you very much for participating in this morning session. It's been a pleasure for me to moderate over the 1.5 days. And I say goodbye here, but very, very happy to be with you again in the next opportunity. And please be back at 13:13 if you can join the afternoon session. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.